For 9 years since marrying Jack, I was treated coldly by my mother-in-law and my stepdaughter Mia, and used as nothing more than a housekeeper. The only thing that sustained me was the gratitude and gentle care from my father-in-law, whom I was taking care of. However, as soon as my father-in-law passed away after a long battle with illness, they both said, "You're no longer needed. Get out of here. I already have someone new, so there's no point in crying and sulking about it," Jack said, shoving the divorce papers in front of me. I understood. "I'll leave after the completion of your father's funeral preparations." I felt a shuddering anger at the way I was treated, but I swallowed it. Then, on the morning of the funeral, I left my in-laws' house. But starting the very next day, I began receiving frantic calls from Jack and my mother-in-law. My name is Hope, 33 years old. I am a homemaker living with my husband Jack, who is a doctor and 12 years older than me, his parents, and his daughter Mia from his previous marriage, making us a family of 5. Before getting married, I worked as an occupational therapist, helping people who had disabilities due to illness or injury. However, when I married Jack, he said, "I know you find your current job fulfilling, but I want you to stay home for Mia's sake." Although it was my first marriage, it was Jack's second, and he was raising Mia, his daughter from his previous marriage. Due to his demanding job as a doctor, he couldn't fully take on the role of a single father, so he lived with his parents. When I divorced my ex-wife, Mia was only 5. My parents and I did our best to shower her with love. But I think she still felt the loneliness of not having a mother. Jack confided this to me, keeping Mia in mind, and then asked me for a favor. "It may be hard to rely on you because we're getting married, but I want to give Mia a home where her mother welcomes her with a welcome home." Is that too much to ask? Although Jack was worried as he brought this up, I readily agreed without hesitation. The reason of my acceptance of Jack's requests was related with my childhood sad memories. My father fell ill and became severely disabled when I was in upper elementary school. As a result, my mother was always busy caring for him and his parents, my grandparents. There was no time for me, even though I was an only daughter. Of course, I never blamed my mother for this. But the truth is, there were many times when I couldn't help but cry because I had to handle all the preparations for field trips and shopping for school trips by myself. Thinking of Mia, whom I had met several times before the wedding, I agreed to Jack's request without hesitation. So, when we got married, I started living with Jack's family. My in-laws, who lived with us, included my father-in-law, a retired doctor, and my mother-in-law, who was a homemaker like me. They told me to handle all the housework that had been done by a housekeeper until then. Of course, I didn't mind doing housework as a homemaker. However, my mother-in-law constantly looked down on me, saying things like, "You're such a dull wife." I didn't like the previous one either. But at least she was well-educated and good-looking. This new one has nothing better except being young. According to Jack, Mia's birth mother, his ex-wife, was a beautiful doctor who graduated from the same prestigious university as him. However, being 3 years older than Jack and often arguing with his mother, she had earned her antipathy. As a result, they separated and divorced shortly after Mia was born. I heard that his ex-wife, unable to handle life as a single mother with young Mia, relinquished child custody in exchange for child support. So Mia was taken in by Jack. It's true that I graduated from a local private university, and compared to his ex-wife, who graduated with honors from a prestigious medical school, I might be considered inferior. I also understood fully that, unlike me, she was a glamorous beauty, as evidenced by the photos of Mia's christening displayed in her room. Even so, when my mother-in-law said, "But it can't be helped. There aren't many young women who can work for us without complaint as long as we feed them," I was at a loss for words. I have no family to rely on. My father, who had been ill for a long time, passed away when I was in the 8th grade, and soon after, my paternal grandparents, who lived with us, also passed away. On top of that, my mother, who had overexerted herself for years, also died after a short illness when I was in the 10th grade. After my mother's death, I temporarily stayed with my maternal uncle. However, when I realized that their interest lay in my mother's small insurance payout, I fled to a distant university. Since then, I had cut off all contact with my relatives. When Jack and I started dating, I told him everything, and he said, "Hope, you're amazing. Despite everything, you haven't lost yourself and have worked so hard. I respect you as a woman and as a person." His words gave me the strength to marry Jack, despite the opposition from friends and colleagues who were wary of his background. That's why I was so shocked when my mother-in-law called me a free housekeeper who could be worked without complaint. When I hesitantly told Jack about it that night, I expected him to scold his mother or at least to comfort me. Looking back, I was naive. Jack, who came home happily drunk, listened to me and then grew visibly angry. And as he turned around, he threw his partially removed suit jacket at me and yelled, "Hey! What are you misunderstanding?" I stood frozen as he shouted, "Who do you think you are to badmouth my mother? I married you because, just like she said, I needed a wife who could be worked for free without anyone complaining." Fueled by alcohol, Jack then began to speak more than usual. He revealed that until shortly before I started working at his hospital, they had always had a live-in housekeeper. However, with the high cost of her salary, her room, and other expenses, it was becoming a significant burden despite high incomes of Jack and his father. Despite this, having been born as the daughter of a professor at the university from which Jack and my father-in-law graduated, my mother-in-law was pampered from a young age and never did any housework after getting married. As a result, even after her first marriage broke down, she didn't change her attitude. When she remarried my father-in-law, her parents hired a housekeeper to handle all the housework at their own expense. However, when my mother-in-law's parents passed away, the situation changed dramatically. Her brother and his wife refused to provide any assistance. Therefore, my father-in-law and Jack had to bear the cost of the housekeeper. But due to my mother-in-law's long-term extravagance on beauty treatments, overseas trips, theater, and shopping, the family finances were in dire straits. To make matters worse, my father-in-law suffered the same illness as my father. Although his prognosis was relatively good, my mother-in-law outright refused to take care of him in his daily needs like meals and bathing. Yet, when it came to placing him in a facility, both my mother-in-law and Jack started scheming, saying, "That's a waste of money. Isn't there a cheaper way?" It was during this time that Jack heard rumors about me starting a new job as an occupational therapist at a hospital. In fact, the professors from my alma mater, who had no close family, acted as my guarantors when I started my job. When the hospital's top management learned this, they said, "It's rare for someone who graduated at the top of their class. She must be exceptionally talented," and expected me to be an immediate asset. However, Jack interpreted this as a labor force that can be overworked without fear of escape. That's why I got close to someone as plain as you and managed to marry you. Otherwise, who would want you? Look in the mirror and figure it out. Laughing heartily, Jack left the bedroom after this revelation. I could only watch him leave in stunned silence. Even if it was discovered, I had nowhere to escape to. Perhaps because of this, both Jack and my mother-in-law stopped pretending around me the next day. In fact, they even dismissed the private caregiver they had hired for my father-in-law, leaving me to handle all the housework and his care. Despite his limited mobility, my father-in-law protested, "This is unreasonable. Are you planning to make her do all the housework and take care of me too?" But neither my mother-in-law nor Jack listened. Thus, from early morning until late at night, I had no time to even sit down due to balancing housework and caregiving. Although my father-in-law had lingering numbness in his non-dominant hand, he tried to do as much as he could himself to lighten my burden. "Hey! Didn't I tell you to prepare a photogenic, low-calorie breakfast with plenty of fruits and vegetables? How many times do I have to repeat myself?" Meanwhile, my mother-in-law imposed her whims without a care, even during busy mornings. "Why didn't you pick up my suit from the cleaners yesterday? I needed it for today's meeting. You're completely useless." Jack was no different from my mother-in-law. What shocked me even more was that Mia started looking down on me, trying to please both Jack and my mother-in-law. Initially, I tried to convince myself that she was just imitating her father and grandmother. However, on a field trip day, after I handed Mia the lunch I had made by waking up early, she deliberately threw it on the floor, stomped on it with her slippers, and laughed. Furthermore, when Mia tore apart the photos of my parents that I had cherished and displayed, and then looked into my tear-streaked face with a smirk as I gathered the pieces, my heart completely broke. The only solace in my daily life was the presence of my father-in-law, who remained thoughtful and kind despite his physical limitations. During my 9 years of marriage, the only peaceful moments I had were when my father-in-law's health was stable, and we could go to the nearby botanical garden to admire the colorful, blooming seasonal flowers together. So when my father-in-law recently fell ill from a minor cold, which quickly deteriorated, leading to his passing, my sense of loss was indescribable. However, as I wept beside his coffin, my mother-in-law said, "You're useless now. Get out of this house." She sneered at me. Jack added, "I already have someone new, so there's no point in crying and sulking about it," while shoving a signed divorce paper in front of me. I felt a wave of anger at the thought that these people couldn't even mourn the passing of someone who was their husband and father. However, arguing would not honor my father-in-law. Understood. I will leave once the preparations for your father's funeral are complete. On the morning of my father-in-law's funeral, after praying at the altar, I left my in-laws' house. But from the next day onwards, Jack and my mother-in-law began bombarding my phone with incessant calls and messages. At first, I ignored them, but the sheer volume of calls and messages day and night became overwhelming. Just as I was reaching my limit, I received the long-awaited notification that the preparations were complete, so I decided to answer the next call. The call came from my mother-in-law, who immediately hurled insults at me. "You thief! How did you seduce your father-in-law?" Such abuse was expected, so it didn't bother me. Noticing that I had answered the phone, Jack snatched the phone from his mother and began shouting at me just as loudly. "Hey, Hope. What's this about you inheriting Dad's entire estate by yourself?" What a pair they were. I calmly replied, "I can't have a reasonable discussion with people who are combative. If you can calm down, we can discuss the inheritance." At which my mother-in-law and Jack, who had been shouting alternately, fell silent. They probably realized that if they angered me and the discussion failed, it would be counterproductive. After a brief pause, my mother-in-law, now speaking in a much more pleasant tone, agreed. And I told her we would meet at the lawyer's office the next day. Then, I hung up the phone. And so, the next day arrived. I was surprised to find my mother-in-law, Jack, and even Mia showing up at the designated office much earlier than the scheduled time. I thought it was a conversation that shouldn't be heard by a child, but my lawyer, James, quickly assessed my concern and said, "At 17. Some people are already out in the workforce. It's part of an adult's duty to make them face their own situation," which helped me make up my mind. Thus, the discussion began. As expected, my mother-in-law started shouting at me with hostility right from the start. The letter we received states that all of my husband's inheritance will go to Hope, and I, as his wife, will only receive the reserved portion. Isn't that ridiculous? Jack shouted just as fiercely. Exactly. Hope isn't even my father's child, just my wife. At that point, James presented the family registry of the deceased and me. As you can see here, the legal heirs are the wife and children. However, since the deceased had no biological children, in this case, the adopted child Hope and the wife are the heirs. He then laid out a diagram illustrating the inheritance relationship clearly in front of the three of them. Actually, what James and I had been waiting for was this legal inheritance information list that could be issued upon submission of the necessary documents, such as the family registry, to the Legal Affairs Bureau. My mother-in-law and Jack, who were comparing the registry and the diagram with astonished expressions, recovered surprisingly quickly. This time, Jack pulled out a letter from his bag and thrust it in front of James's nose as if to get back at him. Even if my wife was adopted by my father, this will states that my mother, myself, and my daughter Mia are to inherit the assets. I don't know how this woman manipulated him, but if you keep backing such nonsense, we'll take this to court. The will he brandished was indeed written in my father-in-law's handwriting, summarizing exactly what Jack had said. The date was only about 6 months ago, so it was understandable that they mistook it for the latest will. My mother-in-law and Jack wore smug expressions, but when James calmly presented another will, their faces turned to disbelief. And rightly so. The will James showed was not a handwritten will like the one Jack had, but a notarized will created with a notary public present. Even if Jack and his mother claimed it was forged or altered, the chances of that being accepted were extremely low. Moreover, the date was just 1 month before my father-in-law's death, clearly indicating it was created after the will presented by Jack. James pressed the point about the validity of the will to my pale mother-in-law and Jack. Jack, you are your mother's stepson. Since you were not adopted by the deceased when he remarried, you have no legal right to inherit. Similarly, Mia is your wife's child from her previous marriage, making her legally unrelated as well. James's straightforward explanation left the two looking not just pale but almost sickly, while Mia, sensing the tense atmosphere, seemed restless. As James mentioned, Jack is the child from my mother-in-law's previous marriage, not my deceased father-in-law's biological son. Originally, my father-in-law had no intention of marrying my mother-in-law. The father of my wife, who doted on his daughter and was my father-in-law, was also my mentor in medical school. I owed him a debt of gratitude and couldn't resist the power dynamics, so I ended up reluctantly getting married. He seemed to have been cornered with no way out. Even so, since they had become a family, my father-in-law initially tried to accept my mother-in-law and Jack. The only reason I remarried you was to avoid having Jack grow up with a single parent. I only need to keep up appearances. So don't get too familiar with me. But my mother-in-law was cold and uncooperative. Furthermore, she held deep grudges against her ex-husband, who had left her. She had her father demote him to a less significant position, received substantial alimony and property division, and also made him pay a large amount of child support. According to my father-in-law, this was all just my mother-in-law's way of taking revenge. The priority order for child support payments is first adoptive parents, then biological parents. By not adopting Jack, she ensured that her ex-husband would continue to bear the full burden of child support, he said, sounding exasperated. As a result, Jack's biological father had to pay high child support until he graduated from medical school, unable to remarry and eventually passing away in despair. Meanwhile, despite claiming it was just for appearances, my mother-in-law enjoyed all the benefits of being a wife without fulfilling any duties, indulging in luxury with my father-in-law's money. When my father-in-law tried to admonish her, she would retort, "What? Are you saying you want to end up like my ex-husband?" And the household remained completely cold. Jack grew up just like his mother, and during his marriage to his first wife, their relationship was marred by his infidelity and extravagance. Moreover, when they eventually divorced, it was Jack who opposed his ex-wife taking Mia and refused to give up custody. He did whatever he pleased but couldn't stand being in a position of being discarded. He flaunted the influence of my wife's father, a professor emeritus, to pressure his wife. My father-in-law, seeing this, advised Jack's ex-wife to temporarily give up custody and proceed with the divorce. Although paying child support might be difficult, as long as that continues, you won't lose all contact with Mia. She might come to understand her mother's feelings as she grows up, he had hoped. But my father-in-law's wishes were not fulfilled, and Mia turned out to be as selfish as her father and grandmother. Though she appeared outwardly polite, she didn't even listen properly when my father-in-law, worried about her future, called her to his sickbed for a final talk. "Why do I have to be summoned here and listen to a geezer who's practically got one foot in the grave? This is so boring." When I reprimanded her for her outrageous behavior, she sneered at me, then slammed the door loudly and left, laughing. I was so overwhelmed with anger and sadness that I couldn't hold back my tears. Seeing Mia's behavior, my father-in-law seemed to lose his final thread of hope and quickly began preparing for the afterlife. He called the lawyer he had been close with to his sickbed and entrusted him with the procedures for adopting me and transferring assets before death. I was surprised to hear the story, but he responded, "You probably already know, but Jack has a woman, and he's planning to use my inheritance to start his own practice. They used you for free to keep more for themselves. I want to teach those people a lesson." With an intense yet calm smile, I had no choice but to nod. And now, James declared that my father-in-law had made significant donations to a foundation contributing to medical advancements. So the total inheritance was less than 1/5 of what they imagined, and my mother-in-law's legal reserved portion was no more than $50,000. Upon hearing this, the two of them went half mad, but it was all the result of their own actions. Jack then turned to me and pleaded, "Hope. You're a kind woman, you'll help me and Mom, right?" But I stood up without a second thought. "The divorce papers you gave me the other day were filed yesterday. You and I are strangers. I only adopted my father-in-law. so I have no obligation to listen to strangers' requests. I said coldly and left the office, glancing at my stunned mother-in-law and Jack and the confused Mia. Despite receiving such thorough explanations at the lawyer's office, mother-in-law and Jack couldn't give up on the inheritance they had been counting on from my father-in-law. They went from one law office to another, consulting to see if there was any chance of their demands being met. However, as expected, every reputable office told them that even if they filed a lawsuit, they had no chance of winning and refused to take the case. But there was an office that approached the desperate mother-in-law and Jack. The head of this office, a lawyer named Robert, was a man in his 50s with a very assertive demeanor. "I've heard about your unfortunate situation. And it seems other offices were quite dismissive. If you leave it to me, I can ensure that your late husband's inheritance will go to you, though it might take some effort." Eager for any help, the two immediately jumped at his offer. Following his instructions, they kept transferring money for initial fees and investigation costs. However, contrary to their expectations, they rarely heard from the man, and when they did, it was always to ask for more money. "If you want to terminate the contract, that's fine. But if you do, you'll lose all the money you've already spent. Are you okay with that?" By the time most of the money my mother-in-law received as her legal share had been spent, the two of them finally lost their patience and demanded to know what was going on. In the end, they were swindled out of all their remaining money. One day, my mother-in-law happened to pass by the building where the office was located while running another errand. She noticed that the office's nameplate, visible from the street, had been replaced with a "For Rent" sign. She hurried up to the office floor in the elevator, only to find it completely empty. Inside the office, there were piles of scattered documents and a sofa set, and a junk dealer was inspecting the items. Half in tears, mother-in-law called Jack, who rushed over, but the junk dealer knew nothing about it. When they inquired with the building manager, they were told that the rent had not been paid for months, and the office had been cleared out after the deadline. With no other options, Jack and mother-in-law reluctantly sought help from mother-in-law's brother, with whom they had been nearly estranged. Mother-in-law's brother, born into a family of doctors but working as a banker, was shocked by their story but consulted a lawyer he was close to. It turned out that the man they thought was a lawyer was a well-known scammer in the area. He targets people like my mother-in-law, who have been turned away by other lawyers because they have no chance of winning. After making empty promises, he extorts money under various pretexts and then disappears. They reported it to the police, but despite numerous reports of this impersonation scam, his whereabouts remain unknown. Even if he were caught, most of the stolen money would likely have vanished into the underworld, meaning any compensation would only be a fraction of the loss. When my mother-in-law learned that any compensation would only cover a small fraction of the loss, she was so shocked that she collapsed on the spot. Moreover, about half the money given to the fake lawyer wasn't enough from the inheritance, so my mother-in-law secretly borrowed it without Jack knowing. When it was revealed that she had made Jack the guarantor without his consent, it led to a fierce argument between them. It couldn't be helped. "Without that inheritance, we wouldn't have been able to clear my debts or yours," my mother-in-law cried, making it impossible to reason with her. Jack had no choice but to confront the lender himself. However, the lender turned out to be a shady operator, and Jack's claims that his guarantee was invalid because he hadn't authorized it were brushed aside. "If you claim it was unauthorized, why don't you sue your mother for document forgery? But doing so might tarnish your reputation as a doctor." He was told this from the lender with an intimidating smile. In the end, with no other options, mother-in-law and Jack had no choice but to declare bankruptcy. While a medical license isn't immediately revoked upon bankruptcy, it was a severe blow to Jack, who had been planning to open his own clinic. Starting a clinic requires significant funds, and even if they had received my father-in-law's inheritance, loans from financial institutions would have been essential. However, once they declared bankruptcy, their credit information would reflect this, making it nearly impossible to secure any loans. With no options left, Jack, who had arrogantly left his previous hospital job, begged to be rehired as a staff doctor. Unsurprisingly, he was turned away at the door, unable to get his job back. Additionally, former students and colleagues of my father-in-law, who had heard about the situation, shunned Jack, leaving him isolated. Debt collectors were relentless, and my mother-in-law, now destitute, was placed with distant relatives and assigned to work as a helper in their factory. Jack, on the other hand, was forced to work at a clinic affiliated with the shady lender. Please, help me. We were husband and wife, after all. A man who sounded a lot like Jack left a tearful plea on my voicemail from a public phone just before being taken away. But I didn't recognize the voice and promptly deleted the message. When it came to Mia, during the inheritance turmoil, she cried and wailed about what would happen to her. Jack, unable to handle her, contacted his ex-wife and asked her to take Mia in. Upon hearing this, Mia got overly excited at the prospect of living a wealthy life with her beautiful and successful biological mother. However, her mother retorted, "Are you kidding me? Do you know why I've been paying you 3 times the usual child support and refused to take Mia in? Just so you know, the child support payments are only until you turned 18. I'll give you the remaining year's worth up front. And that's the end of it," she said, handing Mia an envelope with the bank's name on it before driving off in her car, leaving a stunned Mia behind. That money was quickly spent by Jack and my mother-in-law, and Mia couldn't afford her school fees, leading her to drop out of high school. Since it was a private escalator school, Mia had assumed she would naturally go to university, and the shock of not being able to was immense. Somehow, Mia found out where I was temporarily living and visited my apartment, tearfully begging for help. "Please, I'm sorry. Help me. Even if I wasn't legally adopted, we lived together as a family for 9 years. No matter how conveniently you rewrite those 9 years in your mind, you kept pushing away the hand I extended to you. You and I are, and always will be, strangers." Even as Mia tearfully begged, I firmly rejected her. I was just a child. How can you, an adult, not forgive a child's actions? That's so cruel. Mia retorted, her face pale. You hurt both my heart and your grandfather's heart. It doesn't matter if the person who hurt you is a child or an adult, the pain is the same. There's no excuse for that. With those final words, I shut the door. I could hear Mia sobbing on the other side for a while, but after about an hour, the sound ceased. Later, I heard that Mia was taken in by her biological grandmother, her mother's mother, and was being strictly disciplined to correct her spoiled nature. I don't know what the future holds, but I hope she can make a fresh start and see this as her last chance. After everything was settled, I fulfilled a promise I had made with my late father-in-law. That promise was to study abroad and obtain a license as an occupational therapist. Before my father fell ill, he worked for a major trading company. And I spent my early childhood in a foreign country until I entered elementary school. Because of this, I had always dreamed of working overseas like my father, considering studying abroad. However, with my father's illness and my mother's subsequent struggle with her own illness, that dream had seemed unattainable. While caring for my father-in-law, I confided this dream to him, and he said, "When I pass on, I want you to promise me you'll work hard to make that dream a reality." Smiling, he added, "I believe that is also your late parents' wish. To honor his memory." I spent a year rigorously studying and preparing in my temporary apartment. And finally, I was accepted to study abroad. When I visited my parents' grave to report this, I also silently informed my father-in-law of my departure. Many challenges lie ahead. There will be times when I feel like giving up and times when I cry. But in those moments, I have the unwavering support of my 2 precious fathers and mother, who smile and cheer me on. I'll do my best, Dad, Mom. With those final words, I smiled and began my journey toward my dream.